They called him Stoneface. Silas Blackwood's jaw never betrayed a mood. His hands had carved fortune from stone. One sharp morning, a bench cut into granite side and collapsed, swallowing Silas under tons of fractured rock. The town filed the deed as a routine accident. Jed, a partner of Silas, felt the report like a splinter, where the face broke open. Something bright clung to fresh surfaces, an almost invisible silver dust, gunmetal. The quartz-tipped pole that marked Silas's claim was gone, not broken, not buried, missing. A shard of evidence glinted in the rubble. Jed read it as accusation. He moved slowly, measuring the angles of fallen timber, the direction of splintered grain. He found a smear on a splintered stake and the faint black mark of heat where none should be. Those traces could be coincidence. They could be design. Jed treated them as a map. He watched the rival claim across the ridge, counted the men who handled ledgers, and waited for a mistake. If the mountain had been used, someone had left fingerprints and dust. Jed would follow them, and what he found would force the town to decide what truth it would protect. Jed did not tell himself he was chasing ghosts. He told himself he was keeping a promise to a man who had trusted him with the seam and the shabby bench they called home. The town accepted the sheriff's ledger and the hush that followed. Jed accepted nothing that could be explained with a neat phrase. He started where most searches begin, close and patient. At daylight, he measured the slope with a stick and a keen eye, noting which timbers had splintered outward and which had been sheared clean. He traced tiny fractures in the granite, followed the hairline veins that met at the collapsed pocket. He crouched until his knees ached and found, in a narrow crevice, a dust that did not belong, a cold metallic sheen like ground coin. He scraped the sliver into his palm and held it to the light. It did not sparkle like quartz. It looked like evidence. It felt like accusation. The missing quartz-tipped marker became a map. Its absence argued more loudly than its presence ever could. Jed collected splinters from a bench and followed them downhill, across a scrub of manzanita, and up to the rival claim, where 3 men from the east kept accounts in neat handwriting and argued in measured voices. They wore cuffs that had never seen rope burn. They kept ledgers and they kept smiles ready. In their yard, he found what he suspected. Tiny chips of the same quartz, tucked beneath a crate as if tossed there without thought. The claim they held lay on paper close enough to Silas's to make any honest prospector nervous. He questioned neighbors with a careful bluntness. A packer who ferried supplies remembered a man selling a curious powder at dusk. A tavern keeper mentioned a clockmaker who repaired a stranger's watch and accepted cash without asking his name. Pieces gathered like weathered coins. None declared guilt, but together they formed a pattern. Someone had wanted ground moved in a specific place at a specific time. Jed did what Jed did best. He made a case from small things. He borrowed a chemist's book from a schoolteacher who kept one on a high shelf. And with the help of a retired miner, he sent a sample to a man who knew how to read residues. The message that came back arrived in a cautious tone. The particle resembled a primary blasting compound, a type of primer used by people who knew how explosives worked and reckless enough to use one in the field. It was not a casual coincidence. It was a deliberate choice. This was the moment the town split into 2 stories. To some, the sheriff's file remained unquestioned. Accidents are that tidy. To others, Jed's small collection of artifacts turned an official line into a question. Men who had kept their heads down now looked over their shoulders. Wives stopped leaving bread on porches. Ledger entries were read aloud at kitchen tables like prayers. The thin law that governed claims in the hills was built on notice and habit. Evidence could topple it, but only if someone could make the case stick. Jed could have petitioned the sheriff. He could have marched into the office and demanded an inquest with the blunt force of a grieving partner. He did neither. He kept watching. He watched the Easterners' comings and goings. He watched the clockmaker's hands as they turned over the watches he repaired. He watched a man he had not met before, a drifter with a soot-stained face, move crates at dusk near the rival claim. On a Tuesday night, Jed followed that man a short distance and found a hollowed stake, freshly carved, with a dark smear of an oily binder on its interior. He bent and felt the grain. The stake had been prepared to hold something in place. It had not been used as a stake. It had been used as a vessel. When Jed brought the stake to the chemist, The man did not make bold claims. He examined the binder, the metal dust, and the tool marks with the careful speech of someone who knows how easily people are wrong about what they think they saw. He offered Jed one sentence that cut through the doubt. This was made to be dangerous. Jed's pulse thudded at the simplicity of the verdict. A plan had been built from common materials and callous minds. If this sounds like an accusation too far, tap like to show you want Jed's side of the story. He still had to prove it in a town that might rather forget. He still had to find the hand that had turned a mountain into a weapon, and the men who thought a secret could be buried beneath rock. Jed's evidence had weight when it was small and precise. It became dangerous when it threatened reputations built on bluff and money. The three Easter men met his questions with steady eyes and civility that cut. They called themselves investors, men who understood contracts and ledgers. When Jed asked about the missing quartz pole, they produced receipts and dates, polite as a lawyer's brief. Still, when he flipped the ledger pages by lamplight, he found a margin rubbed raw where a number had been wiped away and a smear where ink had once been pressed too hard. Erasures in a town ledger are where stories hide. The drifter was easy to follow. He came with dusk, moved crates without comment, and drank coffee while keeping to the shadows. Jed watched him for nights and learned his route. The ridge, the back door of the rival claim, a transfer to a man who fixed watches. When Jed stepped out one evening, the drifter flinched and the watchmaker's fingers tightened on a small case. People who do dirty work for others rarely look like men who plan murder. They look like men who collect wages and keep their heads down. Under pressure, the drifter cracked. He admitted carrying a hollowed stake across the ridge and leaving it near the marker at a time when the bench would be under strain. He described a smear of oil inside the stake and a bright powder wrapped in oilcloth. I thought it'd only unsettle rock, he said. The watchmaker admitted selling a small clock to a man who described himself as a prospector in a hurry. The clock's mechanism, the drifter said, was meant to trigger a delay. Their confessions came with caveats and excuses. Paid work, misplaced judgment. But they gave Jed a chain he could follow. Word confessions did not settle the town. It split neighbors into those who wanted quiet and those who wanted reckoning. The sheriff, a man who prized peace in the town's commerce, agreed to ask questions but balked at calling an inquest without more proof. He feared what a formal hearing could do to fragile livelihoods. To Jed, that was not reason but a wall. Jed decided to build proof that could not be waved away. He assembled witnesses who could attest to payments and odd purchases, found a carpenter who hollowed stakes for anyone who paid, and traced the payment from the Eastern claim to a man in town who dealt in clockwork. One night, while the Easter men slept, Jed searched the rival claim shed. He found a crate with a false bottom. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were metal fragments that matched the dust from Silas's slope and small gears that fit the description the drifter had given. He wrapped the fragments in his shirt and walked to the chemist's back room. The chemist handled the samples with careful, methodical silence. When he spoke, he did not shout contempt or glee. He spoke the language of proof. The particles resembled a primary primer, an unstable compound used by people who knew how explosives behaved. It was not proof of intent to kill, the chemist cautioned, but it was proof that something designed to move rock had been prepared. With the crate's contents and the drifter story, Jed carried his case to a cluster of men willing to stand as witnesses. They agreed to ask the sheriff for an inquest. The sheriff's hesitance now met a tangible pile of evidence. The town held its breath. Families read ledger entries by lamp and measured what their neighbors owed. Men who had slept through the winter light now found their sleep thin. Jed's path was no longer private. He knew the next step would either expose a deliberate plan or bury the matter beneath the town's need for calm. He had the fragments, the clock pieces, and the story. He had to choose how to present them where law and loyalty collided. He steeled himself. The inquest would be the town's decision, and Jed intended his proof to leave no easy choice. Dawn would bring questions, some answers, and harder truths ahead. The coroner's table was a plank across barrels in the town hall. Coffee steam rose from tin cups. People sat shoulder to shoulder. A knot of boys peered from the doorway. The sheriff kept his hat tight in his hands. Jed carried a crate of fragments like a ledger of blame. The coroner read the question. Had Silas Blackwood died by accident or by human act? Witnesses spoke in turn. The drifter described carrying a hollowed stake across the ridge and leaving it near the marker. The watchmaker explained how a clock escapement could release a striker after hours. He handed a small gear across the table and turned it slowly for the jurors to see. The chemist laid out the metal shards, the smear from the stake, an oiled scrap of cloth. He spoke with careful words. The residue resembled a primer, a compound used to initiate blasts. He would not say murder. He said these materials did not belong where they were found. The room grew quieter with each word. The Eastern men offered papers and receipts. Their voices were even. They insisted their purchases were for ordinary operations, that trace materials could be explained by legitimate blasting or careless storage. Their lawyer pushed out. Proximity did not prove placement, and placement did not prove intent. Cross-examination found small fractures in the defense. The drifter had lied about the sum he'd been paid. A merchant testified to a strange cash payment the same week. The ledger margin Jed had noticed yielded a smudge where a number had been erased. The watchmaker could not say who had given the clock for alteration, only that it had come with cash. A neighbor woman who had worked the pit described creaks she had heard and how Silas had fretted in the days before his death about a seam that wouldn't sit right. Her simple phrasing landed differently among men who read rock and timber. It made the timing of the device and the collapse feel less random. After the testimony, the coroner and a jury of townsmen retired. They spoke for an hour behind closed doors. In the hall, the mood split between those who wanted quiet and those who wanted exposure. When the jury returned, the coroner read their finding. There was sufficient evidence to suspect that human action materially contributed to the collapse. It was not a murder finding. It did, however, authorize the sheriff to detain and question those implicated, and to refer the matter to county authorities. The verdict rippled through the town. Men who had talked at the market fell silent. The Eastern men arraigned for counsel. Some neighbors whispered that a tidy peace mattered more than a messy truth that could cost livelihoods. Others said a man's death deserved more than ledger saving. Jed felt a small vindication and a heavier task. The inquest had moved the town's official record, but it had not yet brought a trial that would test evidence under oath and cross-examination in a court without hometown loyalties. Proof in a tavern inquest is fragile. Proof in county court demanded documents, sworn statements, chain of custody. That night the sheriff placed a tentative hold on 2 men and sent word to the county seat. Horses carried messages faster than a rumor, and by dawn the case was known along the valley. Jed wrapped the quartz chip he kept in a scrap of cloth and sat in the dark, thinking of the next steps. The town had opted for a path that could lead to indictment or to silence. Either way, danger, tension gripped the valley. If you want Jed to bring this into a full trial, packed testimony, hostile witnesses, and a courtroom scene that decides more than law, tap subscribe. The next episode follows the county writ and the men who will stand under oath. The trial convened in a red brick courthouse overlooking the dry riverbed at Gold Creek Junction, a town larger, louder, and less forgiving than Jed's quiet ridge. Word of the mountain collapse had already spread through every mining camp along the Sierra foothills. By the time Jed arrived, the gallery benches were filled with prospectors, merchants, and drifters chasing spectacle. Some came for justice, others came for entertainment. The judge, a pale man with ink-stained fingers and a thin mustache, called a docket at sunrise. The defendants, the 3 Eastern investors, sat in press coats, their hair slicked back, faces fixed in polite calm. Their lawyer, imported from Sacramento, spoke with the polish of a man accustomed to winning. Jed, by contrast, looked like he'd walked straight out of the hills. Dust-caked boots, callous hands, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. The prosecutor opened with a statement that struck the room still. This case is not about the mercy of the mountain. It is about greed. Greed that needed the appearance of nature to hide a deliberate act. Every syllable echoed through the rafters. He presented the sequence as a timeline, a claim dispute over a narrow strip of quartz-bearing rock. Silas's marker vanishing, a hollowed timber used as a delivery device for a chemical explosive. Jed's sketches of the ridge and the crater became exhibits. The chemist was called first, his evidence laid out in glass jars, each labeled with neat handwriting. Residue from steak. granite-fractured dust, gear soot. When the defense cross-examined, the lawyer smiled faintly. He pointed out that fulminate could occur naturally in trace quantities when certain metals reacted under pressure. He spoke about coincidence, contamination, and rumor. His voice had the smooth rhythm of authority. For a moment, the jury leaned toward him. Then Jed took the stand. He was not an eloquent man. His words came slow, measured, carved like the stones he once broke with Silas. "I don't know chemistry," he said. "I know rock. I know when something falls by weight and when it's pushed." He held up a broken stake head, its core hollowed and lined with the silver residue. "That's no accident. Someone made that." The prosecutor guided him carefully. Jed explained the missing boundary marker, the strange heat mark, the erased ledger number. When he spoke of finding Silas's pick still upright in the dirt, the handle charred. The courtroom was silent except for the creak of the benches. After his testimony, the judge recessed for lunch. Outside, people gathered on the courthouse steps, voices clashing like hammer on ore. Some called it proof of murder. Others said it was the paranoia of a grieving partner. Jed didn't speak. He sat on the curb, watching dust rise in the street and thinking how truth, once struck, scattered like filings, too fine to gather back. When court resumed, the defense brought out its counterpunch. One of the Easterners, a man named Darius Hale, took the stand. He told the jury he had never met Silas, that any overlapping materials came from shared suppliers, that the so-called residue could be remnants from blasting work done months before. He produced receipts, contracts, and letters sealed with neat wax. To a casual ear, it sounded reasonable. But the prosecutor had saved his weight for last. He called a local postmaster, who confirmed that one letter in Hale's set bore a postmark from a date after the accident, yet referred to it as something that had occurred as expected. The small discrepancy landed like a hammer blow. Murmurs ran through the gallery. Hale's composure faltered. He wiped his brow, fingers trembling just slightly. The judge noticed. The defense objected, citing clerical error, but the rhythm of certainty had broken. The next witness, the drifter who carried the hollowed stake, confessed under oath that he had been paid in silver coin and told only to deliver it near the court's pole and leave. When asked who had paid him, he nodded toward Hale without meeting his eyes. The courtroom rustled with whispers. Hale's lawyer rose to protest, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "This court will have order," he said, though his voice betrayed strain. By late afternoon, the light through the high windows turned the dust into columns of gold. The jury withdrew. Outside, a storm gathered across the mountains, gray sheets of rain distant but visible. Nature watching the reckoning had been blamed for. An hour later, the jury filed back in. The foreman's hand shook slightly as he read the verdict. Guilty of manslaughter by deliberate negligence. The charge stopped short of murder, but it was enough to shatter the Eastern Syndicate's hold on the ridge. Jed didn't cheer. He just exhaled, slow, heavy, as if releasing months of coiled wire from his chest. The judge's gavel fell. The gallery erupted into a mix of gasps and low applause. Jed turned once toward the window. The storm had reached the town, rain smearing the glass until the world outside blurred into silver streaks. Somewhere out there, the mountain stood silent, its justice delivered not by rockfall, but by men forced to face what they'd buried. Rain settled the dust, but did not wash the town clean. After the verdict, the ridge felt changed, as if the land itself had tightened and kept watch. Businesses that once extended credit now counted coins at dusk. Men who had boasted in saloons pulled back. Some neighbors closed curtains for days. Others met in low tones to argue whether the trial had been justice or theater. Jed carried the verdict like a small, heavy stone. He slept with a lamp near his bed, waking at the sound of hammers or creaks. The finding did not return Silas. It rearranged consequence. The Eastern men were fined, asset seized, and payments ordered for Silas's family. That did not fill the silence in the pit. Jed kept the scrap of the quartz pole wrapped in oilcloth in his coat. He visited the claim at dusk and sat with the pick set in the dirt. He thought of choices that turned work into harm. A payment, a secret deal, the casual cruelty of men who value profit over a life. Memory for him was tactile, The grain of the wood, the weight of rock, the taste of cold air in the throat at dawn. The county introduced rules for logging blasting materials and for marking claims with witnesses present. Men grumbled at new forms, then taught apprentices to check seams and reinforce props. Accidents that seemed inevitable became less frequent. Change arrived in small practices. A stake tested twice, a ledger entry noted plainly, an extra hand called before a blast. At the tavern, stories shifted. Some locals called Jed stubborn and dangerous. Others called him the partner who would not let a man be buried without a name. People added small things to the post Jed had driven where Silas's marker once stood, a rusted nail, a coin, a strip of leather. The post was plain, its message brief, a single word penned by weather and hand. Years later, the ridge wore fewer scars. New men worked with tools that had been reinforced. Children learned to point out warning sounds. Jed grew older. He still visited the post and felt the ache of absence, but the worst sharpness of grief had dulled. In its place was a steady duty, to remember, to tell what he'd seen, and to make sure the town's ledger kept a clearer, truer record. The mountain remained unmoved. It would not accept praise or blame. The valley, however, had learned a small mercy. A community can choose to demand proof, weigh it, and change how it keeps each other safe. That choice cost a life. It also left a practical trace, rules, witness lists, quieter hands at night, that kept other men from being buried, as though they were accidents. In quiet hours, Jed would write names into a small notebook, adding Silas's beside others lost at hillside. He learned that memory must be active, not assumed, to protect the living. Always. The verdict changed daily life in small, practical ways, but its echo reached farther. Families who had counted on a quiet settlement now recalculated futures. Miners who had shrugged off dangers began to check timbers and log blasts by name. Jed's proof did more than punish a few men. It altered how a community recorded risk and responsibility. Months after the trial, school children learned a simple rule: never handle anything that gleams unexpectedly. Parents told the story of Silas as caution, but they also told of Jed, the man who would not let a death be lowered into ground without a question attached. That double lesson, caution and insistence, became the ridge's new inheritance. Jed himself did not find peace. He kept working the seam because work steadied him. He spoke less in taverns, but more in small gatherings where apprentices learned to measure a cut twice and mark a stake in witness of others. Practical routines replaced some of his restlessness. Ledger entries made plainly. Witnesses called before boundary markers were moved. Supplies logged with receipts tied to names. The law that reached into the hills learned to ask for proof, and people learned to keep it. At night, Jed sometimes stood at Silas's marker and listened to the mountain. He would touch the post and think of hands, those that dug and those that hid their labor. He did not imagine justice as a neat ledger entry. Justice for him was a set of everyday choices that made future accidents less likely. A second-hand check-a-blast, a neighbor who would watch the scene when timber creaked. Not everyone forgave. Some neighbors called Jed trouble and avoided his company. Others thanked him quietly and left small things on the post: a coin, a hand-forged nail, a scrap of leather. The post became a place of private tribute rather than public spectacle. Over the years, its wood wore gray and its edges softened, but the objects remained, a record not of celebration, but of recall. The Easter men paid fines and lost acreage. Their names faded from the ledgers that mattered on the ridge. They left for cities where money could buy a clean slate. The drifter disappeared into the road that leads away from the valley. He was seen once years later at a distant camp with a new set of tools and a face that kept its distance. Histories in small towns are practical things. They shape how tasks are done and how children learn trades. The story of Silas and Jed moved into recipes and rules, into a cadence of work that valued caution. It became part of an oral rule: look twice, mark clearly, and consult another pair of eyes. For court transcripts and notes, tap subscribe. Comment: would you have stood with Jed or walked away? Years pass like seasons on the ridge, and stories settle into habits that shape how people live. The case of Silas Blackwood became more than a headline. It was a lesson spoken at kitchen tables and taught to new hands leaning over picks. Jed kept a quiet watch. He did not expect gratitude. He expected the slow work of making a place safer, a signed witness on boundary moves, a second hand call before a blast, receipts folded into ledgers where before there had been only a nod. Justice and town law proved partial. The men convicted lost holdings and left under public shame, but fines could not fetch a life back. The county's legal changes were practical. Mandated logs for blasting materials, clearer marking rules, penalties for moving claim markers without witnesses. Those changes kept others from becoming victims of convenience or greed. The mountain itself did not alter its indifference. It kept its weather and rock. The living, however, changed. Memory in small towns is objects and rituals. The post Jed set where Silas's marker had stood was tended in small ways. Coins hammered into wood, a nail driven on certain days, a strip of leather replaced when winter made it brittle. These acts mattered because they were ongoing refusals to forget. Children asked why the post held a nail. Elders told a story in plain sentences. The lesson was practical and moral. Watch your neighbor's work. Record unusual purchases. Speak when something feels wrong. Jed aged. His hands kept the slow maps of seams and faults in muscle memory. Some evenings he walked the ridge, tracing lines where earth had moved and where men had moved it. He never lost the ache of absence. He kept a small book listing names of those lost hills and shafts, with dates and short notes on what was learned. Memory, to him, was a tool. To forget was to risk repeating history. Beyond the ridge, the case spread as counsel and practice. Mine supervisors in neighboring counties adopted some rules, and a regional trade school began to teach verification as part of apprenticeship. Change was not a triumphal arc. It was practical, incremental, sometimes resisted. Men grumbled about forms, then taught them to new crews. Small rules became habits. Habits became a culture that valued documented care. If the story leaves one clear idea, it is this. Human choices decide whether accidents are treated as lessons or as the cost of business. A post in the ground and a ledger entry can be part of a living justice that keeps others from falling. Jed's work did not erase grief, but it turned grief into a guardrail. If the story struck you, tap like and subscribe to follow the next chapter on similar cases and how local law evolved across the goldfields. Comment. Would you have confronted the Eastern men or stepped away? Thank you for listening to Shocking History to the World.